Hello students, welcome to Careerflite. Today we are going to continue our history session and start with modern Indian history after we have completed the medieval part in the last class. So, in order to understand modern Indian history, what is important for us to know or to begin with is the advent of the European powers to India. Now, when we talk about the advent of Europeans to India, it was at the stage, at the end stage of medieval India that it took place. And when we talk about the European powers, it was not only the Britishers who came to India as traders, but there were also other powers like the Portuguese, the Dutch, then the British, and at last the French. So we see this chronology of Europeans. They came to India, but the matter of fact is that Portuguese was the first power to enter India with the intention of doing trade with India. Then came the Dutch, and then only this British Empire came to India, and then the French also came. Now, they all came in the form of East India companies, whereby we say, like the British East India Company was, was the one who stayed, for a long period of time in Indian history. Now, when we see all these powers, these Britishers were the one who could actually stay in India and thereby rule India for more than 200 years. Now, what made these Britishers different from all others? However, we should also know that the French East India Company was the last European power to enter India. But however, even the other fact remains that they were the last one to actually leave India even after the Britishers, whereby we find that in 1961 we see that Goa became independent from the French rule. Now let us see why at all these European powers they came to India. Now initially all these powers they came into India basically for trade purposes, to expand the trade and commerce of their own nations. So they entered India. But however, with time, we have seen the kind of British colonialism that happened in India. So thereby, we can say that the Britishers or the other powers they came with the purpose of trade, but however, this finance has actually turned into something administrative as well as political control over Indians. So here, the first time when they came, only finance was the purpose. But later on, with time, these Britishers, their goals actually turned into something which was administrative as well as political. When we see that they not only do trade with India but also captures the entire country and thereby rule us for more than 200 years. Now, here the most important thing is to understand that how was it possible for these Britishers to actually change their nature from financial to administrative and political control over India. Now, in this case, what we need to understand was the nature of the internal Indian kingdoms which existed during the period when Europeans actually entered into India. Now, when we analyzed what was the scenario of India's internal politics, we see that India was basically ruled by the Mughal Empire. However, after this Mughal Empire, we see that these Britishers came into the scene. Now, When we see the map of India, we see that, you know, this area, this bigger area, because the map of India would look something different from today's one. Because when I say, suppose Bengal, it not only included only Bengal, but also Bihar, Assam, and also present day Bangladesh. So, therefore, it was a big territory which was there in Bengal province. Similarly, we see Marathas, then we see Mysore, then we see Hyderabad, here was Punjab or Sindh, etc. Now, what we can see here, it was Awadh, what we today can relate to UP. Now, what was the game which the Europeans played in order to strengthen their rule in India? Now, they when they entered India, what did they notice was that all these kingdoms were very powerful. But however, there were certain kind of internal clashes that was going on inside the kingdom for the power position itself. Now, these Britishers basically took advantage of all these situations, and they were able to enter into the Indian kingdoms and thereby defeat them. Therefore, what we see in Indian modern history is that Britishers went to, fight with all these kingdoms, and thereby gradually within 100 years they capture the entire India. For example, Battle of Plassey of 1757. Now this battle becomes very important when history is concerned, because this was the battle by which Britishers were actually able to capture the biggest province, that was Bengal. And thereby later on we see that, it captures Mysore in various Anglo-Mysore wars. It captures the Marathas in the Anglo-Marathas war, and also we see Anglo Punjab war, etc., and Anglo Sikh war, whereby we see that, the Britishers were actually able to capture the entire India, the bigger provinces of India. But however, near about 1850s, the Britishers noticed that even after capturing all these big kingdoms, they noticed that still there were certain smaller kingdoms which were left, which was not under their control yet. So they thought of capturing the smaller kingdoms, with a different strategy altogether. That means the bigger kingdoms were actually taken over by fighting with the ruler, or we can say the direct confrontation took place in the form of various wars that happened between Britishers as well as the big Indian kingdoms. Now, what about the smaller ones? They are also a very much a part of India. So, therefore, in order to control in the entire land of India, what the Britishers needed at that point of time was, to capture all these small kingdoms. So, Britishers, they were very intelligent, and they were able to make up that in order to capture this kingdom, the smaller kingdoms, direct confrontation won't be fruitful, as well as it would be time consuming. So they thought of doing something else and thereby capture the kingdoms, smaller kingdoms. So what did they do? Now there is a famous plan called as doctrine of lapse by Lord Dalhousie. Now what was it? Now they thought that if we impose certain kind of policies on these smaller kingdoms, there are chances that we can capture them. And fortunately, on the part of Britishers, it worked. Like, according to this policy, doctrine of lapse, it was declared that in India, whichever kingdom did not have their heir, means a son who could actually, succeed the king. With those kind of kingdoms, the Britishers would take over the rule or the charge and thereby control it totally under their rule. So this was the time when coincidentally most of the small kingdoms, they did not had any sons who could actually take up the throne or the power of the kingdom. And that was the chance or the advantage taken by the Britishers. They said that if you do not have such heir for your kingdom, we would actually directly control the kingdom. And in this way, a lot of kingdom came under British rule. So there were also other plans like Wellesley's plan, etc., which actually meant, to capture the smaller kingdoms of India in a strategic way and not by confrontation. And therefore, what we see in about 1857, we see that the entire India somehow comes under the British dominion. Now, what happens at this period? The revolt of 1857. The revolt of 1857. Now, this incident becomes very important from historical point of view. Now, what was it exactly? Now, when we have seen that how the bigger as well as the smaller kingdoms are being taken over by the British Empire. Now, the entire country was being ruled by their laws as well as, the soldiers were both of British origin as well as Indian origin were made to work under the British laws and according to their own rules. So, therefore, what happened was that the soldiers who belonged to all these kingdoms, you know, during the period of Indian kings who were existing, now what happened? Those soldiers were mostly Hindus or else Muslim by religion. Now, once this entire India comes under British rule, now they will have to work according to the British rules. So, therefore, a problem arose at this point of time when we see that as the Britishers were very very well equipped in defense, therefore they had various technologies and also various innovative arms and ammunitions by which they could actually fight the war. And now when the entire Indian population was under their control, now, the soldiers were also under the British control, and therefore, whatever the British dictated to the Indian soldiers, they needed to do because, after all, they were working for the Britishers. Now, at this point, something happened in Indian history which was very remarkable. That means the Britishers made the Indian soldiers to, you know, uh, operate Enfield rifles. That means a kind of bullet. Now, in order to operate that bullet or the bomb, they need to actually beat it off, bite the bullet, and thereby it gets activated. Now, while biting that rifle or Enfield rifle, what happened was that the cover was made up of some kind of fats. Okay, that was either of cows or of pigs. Now, the problem came with the Indian origin soldiers. Now, either they were Muslims or Hindus. So, therefore, Hindus were reluctant to bite the rifles which were made up of cow fats. And on the other hand, the Muslims were reluctant to use the rifles that were made of the fat of pigs. So, therefore, there was a huge discontentment among this soldier community. So this was one of the reason. Moreover, as our Indian society is basically based on religious principles, so therefore we go by religious principle in all aspects of our life. So what happened was that these soldiers were actually made to fight for the Britishers according to their own ways. Like they were supposed to cross the sea in order to fight with, say, Myanmar or some other countries. In that case, the Hindu soldiers denied to do that because it was against their religious principles to cross a sea. So, however, so there was a internal clash between the British authority as well as the soldiers who belonged to the indigenous community or religion of India. However, what happened was that among these soldiers, few of them they did all this work, and what was the effect that came out of it was that whenever these soldiers who have, say, crossed the sea or bitten off the Enfield rifle, they were in their holidays when they went back to their home, they were not entertained. That means they were, you know, decastigated. So that was a great setback to this soldier's family as well as psychology. So therefore, this became a huge problem with time in India. Now, at this moment, we see that this Indian soldiers, who were also called as sipahis or the sepoys, they were very, very discontented with the British authority. And a point came when they could not tolerate anymore. So, and moreover, one more point is that as the British soldiers and the Indian soldiers were working together, were working equally, however, the privileges, the salaries that were paid to the British origin soldiers were far better than the ones paid to the Indian soldiers. So, all these factors actually amalgamated together to, you know, bring out this revolt of 1857, which was actually, you know, done by the sepoys of Indian origin. That means the soldiers of Indian origin. Now, when we see this revolt of 1857, what we have seen that this was an open war happening between the sepoys and the Britishers. But however, we see that although it was a great effort on the part of the Indians for the first time in Indian history to fight against the British, however, we see that the revolt does not sustain for a long period of time. Now, what was the reason that the revolt did not succeed? Now, the reason when we see is that that the revolt, although it was a result of exploitation by the Britishers, but however, it was not very much well planned. So, therefore, the Britishers were able to defeat the sepoys very easily. Moreover, Britishers had many kind of technologies. Britishers were way too well trained than the Indian sepoys. Therefore, they could not sustain for a long period of time. As a result, what happened? This was the time when formally British Empire took over the Indian, you know, uh, rule formally into their own hands, and thereby defeating the sepoys. Now, this is one phase of history that went on. But something very great happened after this failure. Even it was a failure, but still we see that there was a important implication that took place after this revolt of 1857. Now, what was that? Now, by understanding this background of 1857, the remaining modern history could be easier for us to comprehend. Now, we have seen that although the revolt of 1857 fails, but what is important, it was the first effort against the Britishers, first effort against the Britishers. So, therefore, what is happening is that after this event, the Indian people or the Indian leaders, the mass of India, got very, very aware of the exploitation of the British, and somehow they gained a kind of confidence to fight against the British, or else at least to protest against the exploitative rule of the Britishers. Now, after this event, what happened was that in the year 1885, one major event took place. That was the birth of Indian National Congress. Now, what was this Congress? Congress was a formal organization that served as the link between the Britishers and the Indians. Here would be the INC, which later became a political party. However, this served as the political agent by which the Britishers could convey their message to the Indians, as well as the Indians could put their demands towards the British government. Now, let us see what was INC. Now, when we talk about Indian National Congress, we should know that it was, mainly dominated by the powerful leaders of our country who were mostly educated, and also they belonged to the elite classes of the Indian society. But however, their motive was, you know, to you know convey to the British government the actual demands of the Indian people, and thereby, solve the problems of the Indian society. Now, however, when we see this Indian National Congress, working since 1885, we have noticed that with time, what was observed that the Britishers were actually not working according to the theories which were provided to the Indian people. Means the Britishers promised to take care of the Indian people, the interest of the Indian peoples through INC. But however, with the passage of time, it was seen that these commitments were only theoretical and never practical in nature. And that was the time when we see that Indian National Congress, within Indian National Congress, we see two groups coming out: moderates as well as extremists. Now, who are these moderates? These were the people in this Indian National Congress, the leaders who believed that, Indians' interest could be served by negotiations with the Britishers. Okay, negotiations. But however, who were these extremists? These were the group of leaders among these INC members itself who thought that negotiations with the British won't actually serve our purpose of national, integrity or national independence. What would actually serve was violent means. So, this extremist group of leaders, they understood the real nature of the Britishers. They said that negotiations won't help us to achieve our Indian demands. Rather, what we need is, a violent means, a stronger and aggressive move towards the British government in order to fulfill the Indian demands. So, what happened at this point was, the Britishers were somehow, afraid of this kind of extremist, tendency which was coming out of Indian National Congress. And therefore, the Britishers observed that what was the strategy of these extremists. So they saw that extremists were very, very aggressive by nature, and basically the Britishers could not fool these people. So therefore, they became a great threat for the Britishers. Now, when the Britishers researched further, what they found was that Bengal, which I showed you in the map, was a province from where most of the leaders of extremists were present. All right. So, and most of the extremist work was also done from this Bengal, which was a bigger province. All right. Now, see what the Britishers planned was that if this Bengal is producing this kind of extremist tendencies, in a bigger way, then this Bengal would become a threat to our existence in future. So let us do something by which we actually can break this integrity of this Bengal. So they thought of doing something very strange. What was that? That was, the partition of Bengal. So 1905, partition of Bengal took place. Partition of Bengal. Now, what was this? See, suppose Bengal is a larger territory. Now, what the Britishers did was, it divided Bengal into, in this way. This was East Bengal and this was West Bengal. Now, there was a very big politics behind this division. First of all, we should know that what was the explanation that the Britishers gave to the Indian people that why they are going for this kind of partition. Now, Britishers said that in order to, administer this big province in a more proper way or in a more peaceful way or in a more effective way, we are dividing the province and thereby we would rule these two administrative blocks into, in a different way so that, it could be more effective. The governance could be more effective and that would lead to the welfare of the Indians. Now, this was the explanation that was being given by the Britishers to the Indians, but the fact remains something else, which was that this was basically done to divide the people of Bengal into two different halves. Now, let us understand what was the actual motive or what was the actual politics that was there behind this divide and rule policy of Bengal. Now, see, East Bengal and this was West Bengal. Now, at this period of time, what did the Britishers do? They observed the Indian society very properly and they noticed that these two provinces, okay, were full of either Hindus or Muslims in religious ground. That means all the people of these two regions were either Hindus or Muslims from religious point of view. Another point of view, what they noticed was the language. Now, in this entire province, they noticed that there were Hindi speaking people as well as Bengali speaking people. Okay, and also Odia, because Orissa was also included. Now, when they have seen that on the base, there were two bases on which they could actually divide this entire land was language as well as religion. Now, what by this division, what they did was, this Bihar, Odisha, these were all Hindi speaking belt, okay, and therefore they were separated on the basis of language, that was Hindi, and all the Bengali speaking people were, you know, divided between these two provinces. Now, what is happening? Assam was also carved out. Assam, whereby people used to speak Assamese. Therefore, in this western part, what happened was the Bengali speaking people became a minority among this Hindi, Odia, and also other languages. So Bengali speakers becomes minority in Bengal in the western part. Now what happens in the eastern part? See here the politics was played on the basis of religion, whereby Muslims were sent here, whereby Bengali speaking Muslims were here. So here also the Hindus become minority. So what happens is that by doing all these things, the Hindu Bengalis were actually reduced to minorities in both these provinces. As a result, what happened was that this extremist group also, became a bit weaker because their unity with all these other groups actually has broken up by the effort of the Britishers in the name of divide and rule policy. This is what was partition of Bengal. Now, this becomes very, very important because after this, what we saw is that Swadeshi movement coming in. We see that Swadeshi movement coming into the picture. Now, what was this Swadeshi movement all about? When this Bengal was being partitioned, then people of Bengal were really very sad, and also the entire Indian leaders who understood the actual game behind this divide and rule policy. And that was the time when this boycott or the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi movement means nothing but agitation against the government in order to protest this divide and rule. Now, what exactly was the technique? The technique was nothing but to boycott the foreign goods. That means whichever goods or whichever services that were being provided by the Britishers were boycotted from India, and thereby more and more use of Indian goods and services were, promoted and also taken up. Now, in this case, we'll have to understand that common people, boycotted mostly the goods of the British origin. However, when it comes to service, we again see that starting from the elite services, say the lawyers, the academicians, to the lowest professionals like the barbers, the cobblers, etc., they also denied service to the Britishers. So therefore we can see a huge move taken by the Indian masses in order to protest this partition of Bengal, which was done in the name of language and religion. But however, they said that they did it for administrative convenience. So we see that Britishers were now very much, afraid of such kind of extremist tendencies. So therefore, they banned this extremist group. Moreover, there were also some kind of internal clashes going on between the moderates and the extremists within the Indian National Congress. So what happened was that by looking all these trends, the Britishers understood that there might be certain problem, with them if this extremist group, exist, and thereby they become strong in Indian politics. So therefore, what they came up was the Act of 1909. The Act of 1909 was given by the Britishers in order to actually appease the Indian masses in the name of certain kind of rules which were for the welfare of the Indian people. Now, when we see that the practical aspect of this Act of 1909, we see that it was a big redundance because those were again only in papers and never in practice. So therefore, it was of no use basically. But however, what we see after the Act of 1919 was a major event in this Indian history. Now, we see that home rule movement came in, during 1916, whereby Annie Besant was the person who came up, in a major way in India with this home rule movement. Now, Annie Besant was an Irish freedom fighter who fought in her own country a long war for independence, and thereby she succeeded. And then only she came to India to establish the similar home rule movement of India in order to, you know, help India to attain freedom from the British rule. Now, here one thing is important that Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, also joined hands with Annie Besant and took, took up this home rule movement in Maharashtra, etc. So therefore, Annie Besant operated from South India, whereas Tilak operated from the rest of India. So, especially the Maharashtra area. So at this point, we see that Gandhiji comes up in the scene. Now, Gandhi becomes a very important figure when we study about the freedom struggle of India. Now, when Mahatma Gandhi comes into picture, however, we'll have to know a little bit about Mahatma Gandhi, who actually he was, and suddenly how he emerges in the Indian politics, and thereby his strategies would actually help us finally to gain independence in 1947. Now, see, Gandhiji was a person who belonged to a good family, and therefore he was also an educated person. He went to London to complete his law, and thereby he went to South Africa for practicing the law. Now, when he went to South Africa, he saw that these Britishers were exploiting the South African people as well as the Indian peoples who resided in South Africa in the name of colonialism. But however, the nature of colonialism in South Africa was worse than the Indian scenario, because there the people were not only subjected to colonial domination on the basis of society or economy, administratively, etc., but also they were being exploited on the basis of race, means the complexion of the people of South Africa. Now, the Britishers were generally fair by complexion, and the Africans were generally dark by complexion. Now, this became the basis of exploitation, whereby they were also engaged in some kind of slave trade, etc., which was humanly very much exploitative. Now, when Gandhiji noticed all these trends in South Africa, and also he personally experienced some of the exploitations by this British authority there, or the colonial authority there, he decided to take up this cause and fight for the people who were being exploited in South Africa, and that too the Indians were also included who resided in South Africa. Now, when Gandhiji took up the cause, he did many efforts to actually, you know, weaken this colonial rule in South Africa, and therefore he also succeeded in this effort. Then later on, when he came to India, he saw the similar situation was prevailing in India. But by that time, he already gained experience about freedom struggle movement, which he took up in South Africa on the basis of satyagraha principles. Now, what exactly is satyagraha, according to Gandhiji, was that it is a non-violent means of attaining independence, whereby truth should not be separated from oneself, and one should be very much determined as well as non-violent by nature while fulfilling one's goal of independence. Now, this was satyagraha, which became very much successful in South African nation. Now, when he comes back to India, he saw that the Britishers were again exploiting the Indians, in a very rude way. Now, at this point, Gandhiji did not, in fact, he decided not to be moved by any of the opinions made by, say, INC or any other leaders, okay, based on their own respective experiences. So what he decided, he said, no, I won't go by any of the words of any person or organization regarding the British rule, but what would I do? I would gain the real time experience by actually going out to the entire India and to the masses of India in order to understand their real problems and their real demands that they want from the British rule. Then he toured India for a long 1 year, and whereby he has gathered many experiences as well as the problems that are really faced by the Indian masses at ground. Now, that was the point. He has actually observed the various exploitations that was being meted out to these people of India, and people, and basically the common people, were suffering a lot in India. So, that was the moment when we see that Gandhiji transforms himself into a saintly figure whereby he actually leaves all the luxurious things of his life, and also the way he used to lead his life earlier. And then we see him acquiring a single piece of khadi cloth, and thereby he stays afterwards till his death, he stays in the same attire. Now, what was the reason that despite being a lawyer and also from a good family background, he wears a khadi single cloth of peace around his body? Was that his philosophy and his thinking was very great. And therefore, what he said, that in order to solve the real problem of Indian masses, I need to understand the problems of Indian masses practically. Now, he saw that most of the people of India were very, very poor. They did not have food, they did not have clothes, they did not have shelter. So, therefore, that was the point. He was very much moved by this, fact. And then he decided that he would also acquire, or he would adopt such kind of lives like that of the poor population of India, so that he could understand their real problems in practical sense of terms. And therefore, he started his Satyagrah Andolan in India. And then he started the Satyagrah in India, beginning in Champaran, that is in Bihar, thereby in Ahmedabad, and then in Khera. Now, all these three places becomes important, whereby we see that in Champaran as well as in Khera, why was he working? He was working for the peasants who were being exploited in the name of taxation by the Britishers. Now, he worked and thereby he succeeded by Satyagraha principles. Now, in Ahmedabad again, he worked for the workers of the mills who were exploited by the Britishers. They were denied many services as well as bonuses, etc. But Gandhiji went on to work for these people, talk for these people, and therefore he was very, very successful in getting back the rights of these mill workers in Ahmedabad Satyagrah. So we see that formally Gandhiji comes into Indian politics in the year 1918, when we see all this Satyagrah in different places taking place in respect to different incidents. Now, that was the time when Gandhiji, witnessed the infamous Jallianwala Bagh massacre, okay, where we see that we'll come to the comments later on. But first, let me complete the entire lecture, which would be helpful to you people. So, we have started with Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now, what was it? Now, when we see this Jallianwala Bagh massacre, there is a place called Jallianwala. Now, there, what happened was that there was a public meeting that was being organized by the common people, the leaders of Jallianwala, a place called Jallianwala, regarding the non cooperation movement that was again initiated by Gandhiji. Now, uh, according to this non cooperation movement, what happened was that people were to non cooperate with the Britishers. Now, when we see Britishers were exploiting the Indian people, to a very large extent, what we have seen that, people started protesting among themselves. When Gandhiji came into picture, actually the masses of India got a bit of confidence in them, and they started viewing Gandhiji as a mass leader. And that was the time in Jallianwala, a small park was there, and people, actually assembled there to organize a meeting. Now, when the British authority got this news that a meeting was being held in this park, which was regarding a protest against the British rule, they really became very furious, and therefore a British authority called as Lord Dyer, who came up to this place, and that park was surrounded by high walls and a single entrance. Now Dyer stood before the entrance and ordered the soldiers to open fire on the people around. Now during this open fire, many people, including children, old people, everybody, they died in large number. And because it was bounded by high walls, therefore people could not actually leave the place, or they could hide themselves. So this incident was very, very unfortunate, whereby innocent people were being killed for no reasons, or else only for organizing and meeting. Now therefore this incident moved Gandhiji very much, and therefore he started the you know non-cooperation movement formally in India after this incident. But however, while going for this non-cooperation movement, or the civil disobedience movement also came up with this, whereby Gandhiji was very much strict to his principles when he said that yes, protest would be there against the British rule, but however, all the protests should be non-violent in nature, and it should be according to the Satyagrahi principles. That was the basis of Gandhian principle. But however, as this movement was going on, it was going on in full swing, and then what happened? Suddenly, another incident took place. That was the incident of Chauri Chaura. Now, Chauri Chaura is a small place in Uttar Pradesh, whereby people were actually protesting against the British rule near a police station, whereby the police were you know uh, demonstrating. Now, these people who were there for demonstrations, now the police went on, aggressively, restricting these demonstrators to carry on the demonstration. At this point, the demonstrators, that means the common people, got very furious against this police, and thereby they went on to set fire to the police station itself, and the doors were all locked. And as a result, what happened? 22 policemen were burned to death. So, when they were burned to death, Gandhiji immediately called off the civil disobedience movement. He said, no, we cannot continue the movement anymore because violence has been involved in this movement. And Gandhiji was strictly against what? Violence. So, therefore, he only believed in non-violence means of attaining independence. But however, this incident of Chauri Chaura went against his non-violence principles. So this was the time when he called off the entire movement, and this movement came to an end. But however, many leaders of Indian National Congress, as well as Indian politics, they were also working parallelly for constitutional development in India. Now, a very kind of aggressive person who would help in uh, attaining independence, but sometimes maybe by violent means, and not completely led us towards achieving our independence. So this is all about modern India. If you like this video, please subscribe it, share it. Thank you so much. What happened? देखছিলাম